The prison gym was loud with iron and ego. Weights slammed, men shouted, and in the center of it all stood the strongest inmate on the block, muscles bulging, scars like trophies. That's when he noticed the quiet one. No headphones, no crowd, just a thin man in the corner, moving slowly, almost gently. The strong man laughed. "You stretching?" he mocked. "This is prison, not a yoga class." The room went quiet as he stepped closer. "You want to learn how real men fight?" He shoved the quiet inmate in the chest. Hard. The man stumbled back, but didn't fall. He didn't raise his fists, didn't glare, didn't say a word. He just adjusted his stance. Feet rooted, shoulders loose, breath steady. The strong man swung, full power. And that's when it happened. The quiet inmate turned, barely touching him. One soft, flowing motion. A step, a shift, a palm. The strong man's eyes went blank. His legs buckled. 200 pounds of muscle collapsed to the floor like a switch had been flipped. No blood, no struggle, just silence. No one in that room understood what they'd just seen. But the quiet inmate did, because that wasn't luck. That wasn't strength. That was Tai Chi, the kind meant to end fights before they begin. Stay with me until the end, because what this man does next inside that prison makes everyone realize who the real danger has always been. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's get into it. Marcus Chen had been inside Riverside Correctional for 18 months. While other inmates lifted weights, played cards, or formed crews, Marcus spent his mornings in the corner of the gym practicing forms that looked like dancing to anyone who didn't know better. Slow circles with his arms, gentle steps that seemed to flow like water, deep breathing that made his chest rise and fall like ocean waves. The other inmates thought he was soft. They whispered about the quiet Asian guy who never caused trouble, never raised his voice, never threw a punch. Some figured he was scared. Others assumed he was just weird. But Marcus wasn't bothered by their assumptions. He'd learned long ago that people see what they expect to see. What they didn't see was the 20-year journey that had brought him to this moment. Marcus had started learning Tai Chi when he was 12 years old, not in some fancy studio, but in a cramped basement in Chinatown from his grandfather, a man who'd survived wars and revolutions by understanding that true strength came from knowing when not to use it. His grandfather had taught him that Tai Chi wasn't just exercise. It was a martial art disguised as meditation, a weapon hidden in plain sight. The slow movements that looked like gentle stretching were actually combat techniques, refined over centuries to redirect force rather than meet it head-on. While other fighting styles relied on speed and power, Tai Chi used patience and precision. Marcus had practiced those forms for hours every day, even after his grandfather passed. Through high school, through college, through the mistakes that eventually landed him in prison, the movements had become as natural as breathing, the philosophy as ingrained as his own heartbeat. But nobody in Riverside Correctional knew any of that. They just saw a quiet man who kept to himself. Big Tommy Rodriguez was different. At 6'4" and 250 pounds of solid muscle, Tommy was the undisputed king of the prison gym. He'd been locked up for 8 years, and in that time, he'd built a reputation that made other inmates step aside when he walked past. Tommy didn't just work out. He dominated every piece of equipment, every conversation, every corner of the space. Tommy had earned his position through violence and intimidation. In his first year inside, he'd put 3 men in the infirmary and sent a message that echoed through every cell block. Don't mess with Big Tommy Rodriguez. The guards knew it. The inmates knew it. Even the warden knew it. Tommy's daily routine was as predictable as the sunrise. He'd enter the gym at exactly 10 in the morning, claim the best bench press, and proceed to lift weights that made the entire rack shake. Other inmates would gather around to watch, some genuinely impressed, others just smart enough to show respect. Tommy fed off their attention like fuel. That's why Marcus's presence bothered him so much. Here was this skinny guy, maybe 160 pounds soaking wet, completely ignoring the unspoken rules of the gym. Marcus didn't ask permission to use equipment, didn't nod respectfully when Tommy entered, didn't even seem to notice that the king of the gym existed. For weeks, Tommy had watched Marcus go through his strange routine, the slow movements, the deep breathing, the peaceful expression that never changed, no matter how loud the gym got around him. It was like Marcus existed in his own world, completely separate from the harsh reality of prison life. Tommy's crew started making jokes about it. "Look at the dancer," they'd whisper. "Bet he'd break if you breathed on him wrong." They'd laugh and flex their own muscles, secure in their understanding of how things worked in their world. But Tommy wasn't laughing anymore. There was something about Marcus's calm that felt like disrespect. In a place where respect was currency and reputation was survival, Marcus's indifference was like a slap in the face. Tommy had built his entire identity on being feared, and here was someone who clearly didn't fear him at all. The tension had been building for weeks. Tommy would make louder noises when Marcus was nearby, drop weights harder, talk trash about pretty boys who think they're too good for real workouts. But Marcus never reacted, never even looked in Tommy's direction. That morning started like any other. Marcus arrived at his usual time, found his usual spot in the corner, and began his usual routine. His movements flowed like water, each transition smooth and deliberate. His breathing was so controlled, it barely moved his chest. His eyes remained closed, focused inward. Tommy was having none of it. He'd spent the night thinking about respect and reputation, about how other inmates were starting to whisper that maybe Big Tommy wasn't as untouchable as everyone thought. If he couldn't even get a reaction from some scrawny nobody, what did that say about his power? The confrontation was inevitable. Tommy had made his decision the moment he walked into the gym that morning. He was going to teach the quiet man a lesson about where he stood in the prison hierarchy. He was going to remind everyone who ran things in this place. What Tommy didn't understand was that Marcus had been preparing for this moment his entire life, not hoping for it, not wanting it, but understanding that it would eventually come. His grandfather had warned him about men like Tommy, bullies who mistake volume for strength, who confuse aggression with power. The gym fell silent as Tommy approached. Even the guards seemed to sense something was about to happen. Inmates stopped their workouts and turned to watch. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Marcus stood perfectly still, watching Tommy's massive frame sprawled across the gym floor. The big man's chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. His eyes rolled back, consciousness flickering like a dying light bulb. The silence in the room was deafening. 23 inmates and 2 guards stood frozen, their minds struggling to process what they'd just witnessed. Tommy's crew was the first to move. Rico, a stocky man with gang tattoos covering his neck, rushed forward and dropped to his knees beside their fallen leader. "Tommy! Tommy, wake up!" His voice cracked with panic. The other members of the crew looked between Marcus and their unconscious boss. Confusion written across their faces. Marcus hadn't moved from where he stood. His breathing remained steady, his posture relaxed. To anyone watching, it looked like he'd barely exerted himself. No sweat on his forehead, no tension in his shoulders, just the same peaceful expression he'd worn throughout his entire routine. Guard Williams was the first official to react. He'd been working at Riverside for 12 years and had seen every kind of prison fight imaginable. Stabbings, beatings, riots that left men broken and bloody. But this was something entirely different. He spoke into his radio with a voice that betrayed his bewilderment. "Medical to the gym, inmate down, no visible injuries. Repeat, no visible injuries." Dr. Sarah Mitchell arrived within minutes, her medical bag in hand and her face set in the professional mask she'd perfected during her 5 years as the prison's head physician. She knelt beside Tommy and began her examination. Pulse was strong. Breathing was normal. No signs of trauma, no bruises or cuts. His pupils responded normally to light. Every vital sign suggested he was simply unconscious, as if he'd fainted. But Dr. Mitchell had never seen anyone faint from a gentle touch to the chest. She'd read Tommy's medical file. The man was in peak physical condition. No history of heart problems, no neurological issues, no medications that might cause sudden unconsciousness. Yet here he was, completely unresponsive after what witnesses described as barely any contact at all. The whispers started immediately. Inmates who'd witnessed the encounter began sharing their versions of what happened, each telling slightly different details, but all agreeing on the impossible nature of what they'd seen. Some swore Marcus had struck Tommy with lightning speed. Others insisted he'd barely touched him at all. A few claimed they'd seen some kind of energy transfer between the two men. Old-timer Johnson, who'd been locked up for 23 years and had seen everything the system had to offer, shook his head in amazement. He'd grown up hearing stories about martial arts masters who could knock out opponents without throwing punches, but he'd always assumed they were just legends, prison folklore, tales told to pass the time. Now he wasn't so sure. Marcus finally moved, walking slowly toward the exit. The crowd parted before him like water around a stone. No one dared block his path. The quiet man who'd been invisible for 18 months had suddenly become the most talked-about inmate in the facility. But Marcus showed no sign of enjoying the attention. If anything, he looked almost sad about what had happened. Tommy regained consciousness after 8 minutes. Dr. Mitchell helped him sit up slowly, checking his coordination and asking basic questions to assess his mental state. Tommy remembered everything up until the moment he'd thrown his punch. After that, nothing but darkness until he woke up on the gym floor surrounded by concerned faces. "What happened to me?" Tommy asked, his voice hoarse and confused. The question hung in the air like smoke. Dr. Mitchell had no medical explanation to offer. Guard Williams had no security protocol that covered this situation. Tommy's crew had no answers that made sense. Rico helped Tommy to his feet, the big man swaying slightly as his balance returned. Tommy looked around the gym, his eyes searching for Marcus, but the quiet man had already disappeared. The humiliation was worse than any physical pain Tommy had ever endured. He'd been defeated by someone half his size without even understanding how it happened. Word spread through the prison like wildfire. By lunchtime, every inmate in every cell block had heard some version of the story. The details grew more fantastic with each telling. Some claimed Marcus had used some kind of mystical power. Others insisted he was a secret government agent with special training. A few believed he'd used pressure points to shut down Tommy's nervous system. The reality was both simpler and more complex than any of the rumors suggested. Marcus had used a technique called Fa Jin, the explosive release of internal energy that was the highest expression of Tai Chi combat application. It wasn't magic or mysticism. It was biomechanics and timing refined to an art form that took decades to master. The technique worked by redirecting an opponent's force back into their own body, amplified and focused through precise contact points. When Tommy had thrown his punch, Marcus had intercepted the energy at exactly the right moment, using Tommy's own momentum against him while adding his own focused power. The result was a shock to Tommy's nervous system that caused immediate unconsciousness. But explaining the science behind it wouldn't have helped anyone understand what they'd witnessed. In a world where violence was measured by blood spilled and bones broken, Marcus had demonstrated a form of combat that operated on entirely different principles. He'd won without fighting, dominated without aggression, proven his superiority without causing lasting harm. The psychological impact on the prison population was immediate and profound. Inmates who'd never heard of Tai Chi suddenly found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew about fighting and strength. The big, muscular men who'd always ruled through intimidation began to wonder if their approach was as effective as they'd believed. Marcus returned to his cell and sat on his narrow bunk, closing his eyes and breathing deeply. He thought about his grandfather's teachings, about how true strength came from understanding rather than force. The old man had always warned that demonstrations of power should be used sparingly, only when absolutely necessary. Today had been one of those times. The incident would change everything at Riverside Correctional. The careful balance of power that had existed for years was about to shift dramatically. Tommy's reign as the prison strongman was over, even if he didn't realize it yet. And Marcus, the quiet man who just wanted to serve his time in peace, was about to discover that sometimes the greatest strength becomes the heaviest burden. In the days that followed, the gym would become a different place entirely. The loud clanging of weights would continue, but it would be accompanied by something new, a careful respect for the thin man in the corner who moved like water and struck like lightning. The next morning brought attention to Riverside Correctional that felt different from anything the inmates had experienced before. The usual rhythm of prison life, the predictable patterns of dominance and submission that governed every interaction, had been shattered by 8 minutes of unconsciousness and one impossible moment in the gym. Tommy Rodriguez sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at his hands. These were the same hands that had broken jaws and crushed windpipes, the same fists that had built his reputation through years of calculated violence. But yesterday, they might as well have been made of paper. He flexed his fingers, testing the strength that had always defined him, searching for some explanation that would make sense of his humiliation. His cellmate, a wiry man named Snake who'd been inside for armed robbery, watched him nervously. Snake had seen Tommy in bad moods before, had witnessed the explosive rage that could turn deadly in seconds. But this was different. This wasn't anger. This was something far more dangerous. Doubt. "You gonna eat breakfast?" Snake asked, his voice carefully neutral. Tommy had been sitting in the same position for 20 minutes, lost in thoughts that seemed to cycle endlessly through the same impossible question. How had a man half his size knocked him unconscious with what looked like a gentle touch? Tommy didn't answer. He was thinking about respect, about reputation, about the careful architecture of fear he'd built over 8 years inside. In prison, your status wasn't just about survival, it was about identity. Without his position as the undisputed king of the yard, who was Tommy Rodriguez? Just another inmate counting down days until release. 3 cells down, Marcus Chen was also awake, though his morning routine hadn't changed. He sat cross-legged on his thin mattress, eyes closed, breathing in the measured rhythm his grandfather had taught him decades ago. The meditation wasn't about finding peace. It was about maintaining the balance he'd cultivated through years of practice. Yesterday's confrontation had been necessary, but it had also been a failure of sorts. A true master would have found a way to avoid the conflict entirely. The prison grapevine was already working overtime. Stories spread through the corridors like wildfire, each retelling adding new details and embellishments. Some inmates claimed Marcus had used some kind of death touch. Others insisted he'd hypnotized Tommy with his eyes. A few of the more creative storytellers suggested he'd learned secret techniques from Chinese spies. But the truth was both simpler and more complex than any of the rumors. What Marcus had demonstrated wasn't mystical or supernatural. It was the result of decades of disciplined training in an art form that most people misunderstood completely. Tai Chi, when properly applied, wasn't the gentle exercise routine performed in parks by elderly retirees. It was a devastatingly effective martial art that had been refined through centuries of real combat. The technique Marcus had used on Tommy was called Jin, hidden power. It involved redirecting an opponent's force back into their own body through precise timing and positioning. When executed correctly, it could cause temporary disruption of the nervous system, resulting in unconsciousness without visible injury. But mastering such techniques required not just physical skill, but a deep understanding of human anatomy, energy, flow, and combat psychology. Marcus's grandfather had been one of the last generation to learn these applications in their original context. Born in rural China during a time of constant warfare, the old man had seen Tai Chi used as it was originally intended, not as exercise, but as a method of survival. He'd passed these teachings to his grandson not as curiosities, but as practical knowledge that might one day save his life. Now, sitting in his cell, Marcus wondered if his grandfather would have approved of yesterday's demonstration. The old man had always emphasized that true mastery meant never having to prove your skill. The greatest victories were the fights you never had to fight. But sometimes, Marcus reflected, circumstances forced your hand. The breakfast bell echoed through the cell block, and the familiar sounds of prison morning began. Metal doors sliding open, boots shuffling down concrete corridors, the low murmur of conversations conducted in careful tones. But today, something was different. The usual swagger in men's walks seemed muted. The casual displays of dominance that normally punctuated every interaction were notably absent. Marcus made his way to the cafeteria, moving with the same unhurried pace he always maintained. But now, other inmates stepped aside to let him pass. Not out of fear exactly, but out of a new kind of respect mixed with uncertainty. They'd all heard the stories, and while the details varied wildly, everyone agreed on one thing. Marcus Chen was not the man they'd thought he was. The cafeteria was a study in social dynamics shifted overnight. Tables that had been rigidly segregated by race, gang affiliation, and prison hierarchy now showed subtle changes. Men who'd never spoken to each other were engaged in animated conversations about what they'd witnessed or heard. The usual loud bravado was replaced by quieter, more thoughtful discussions. Tommy entered the cafeteria last, flanked by his crew, but somehow diminished by their presence. Rico and the others maintained their loyal positions around their leader, but their body language betrayed their uncertainty. The man they'd followed for years, the source of their status and protection, had been revealed as vulnerable. If Big Tommy Rodriguez could be dropped by a gentle touch, what did that mean for the rest of them? Marcus took his usual seat at a corner table, alone as always. But today, the isolation felt different. Before, other inmates had ignored him because they thought he was insignificant. Now they avoided him because they weren't sure what he was capable of. The distinction was subtle but profound. Across the room, an elderly lifer named Clarence Washington watched the dynamics play out with the wisdom of someone who'd survived 32 years inside. Clarence had seen the rise and fall of dozens of prison strongmen, had witnessed the cycles of violence and retribution that defined institutional life. But what he'd heard about yesterday's incident suggested something entirely new was happening at Riverside. Clarence had served time with men from every background imaginable: gang leaders, mob enforcers, military veterans, and street fighters. He'd learned to read the subtle signs that indicated who was truly dangerous and who was just putting on a show. Most of the men who talked the loudest and acted the toughest were compensating for deep insecurities. The ones you really had to watch were the quiet ones, the men who carried themselves with genuine confidence rather than manufactured bravado. Marcus Chen fit that profile perfectly, but with an additional element Clarence had rarely encountered. There was no anger in the man, no barely contained rage looking for an outlet. Instead, there was a kind of centered calm that suggested complete self-knowledge. In Clarence's experience, such men were either saints or the most dangerous individuals you could encounter. Sometimes they were both. The morning meal passed without incident, but the undercurrents of change were unmistakable. Guards noticed the shift in atmosphere even if they couldn't articulate what had changed. Lieutenant Hayes, a 20-year veteran of the corrections system, made a note in his daily report about the unusual calm in the general population. He'd learned to be suspicious of sudden changes in prison routine, knowing they often preceded major disturbances. But this felt different from the tense quiet that usually preceded violence. This was more like the aftermath of a storm, when the air itself seemed to have been washed clean. Whatever had happened in the gym yesterday, it had reset the social order in ways that might take weeks to fully understand. As inmates filed out of the cafeteria toward their work assignments, Marcus remained at his table for a few extra minutes. He wasn't avoiding the crowd or making a statement. He was simply finishing his meal at his own pace, maintaining the same routine he'd followed for 18 months. But now, that simple act of consistency carried additional weight. In a world where change usually meant chaos, Marcus represented something different: stability earned through strength rather than imposed through fear. The real test would come in the yard that afternoon. The recreation period was when the prison's social hierarchy was most visible, when territorial disputes were settled and reputations were made or broken. Everyone would be watching to see how Tommy handled his first public appearance since the incident. More importantly, they'd be watching Marcus to see if yesterday had been a fluke or a glimpse of something much more significant. The afternoon recreation period arrived like a storm front moving across the horizon. Inmates filed into the yard with an energy that felt electric, charged with anticipation and unspoken questions. The basketball courts buzzed with activity, but today the games felt secondary to the real drama everyone was waiting to witness. Marcus walked onto the concrete with his usual measured pace. The yard was divided into invisible territories that had been established through years of violence and negotiation. The weight area belonged to Tommy's crew. The basketball courts were controlled by the East Side gang. The far corner near the fence was neutral ground, where the older lifers gathered to play chess and dominoes. But today, those boundaries seemed less certain. Men glanced around nervously, unsure of where they stood in a hierarchy that had been turned upside down in 8 minutes. The usual displays of dominance felt hollow when everyone had heard about a man being knocked unconscious by what looked like a gentle touch. Tommy emerged from the building surrounded by his crew, but his usual swagger was noticeably absent. Rico walked slightly ahead, as if trying to clear a path through uncertainty. The other members of the group maintained their positions, but their confidence had been shaken. They were still Tommy's men, but Tommy himself seemed diminished somehow. The weightlifting area had always been Tommy's kingdom. It was here that he'd established his reputation, through displays of raw power that left other inmates awed and intimidated. The bench press station was his throne, the heavy plates his scepter. But as he approached his usual equipment, something felt different. Other inmates who would normally gather to watch his workout remained at a respectful distance. The admiring crowds were gone, replaced by curious stares and whispered conversations. Tommy set up for his routine, loading the bar with the same massive weight that had always impressed onlookers. But today, the display felt desperate rather than dominant. Marcus had taken his usual position in the corner of the yard, beginning the slow, flowing movements that had once seemed so out of place in this environment. But now, other inmates watched with different eyes. The gentle circles and deliberate steps no longer looked like dancing or stretching. They looked like preparation for something far more serious. A group of younger inmates gathered at a safe distance, studying Marcus's movements with newfound respect. These were men who'd grown up believing that strength came from muscle mass and aggressive posturing. Yesterday had introduced them to concepts they'd never considered before. "You see how his feet never cross?" whispered Carlos, a 22-year-old serving time for assault. "My cousin did karate when we were kids. Said something about balance being more important than power." His friend Miguel nodded thoughtfully. "My grandmother used to do something like that in the park back home. We always thought it was just old people exercise. But look at how he moves. That's not exercise, man. That's training." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the weight area. Tommy had attempted to bench press his usual maximum load, but something was wrong. The weight that he'd lifted countless times before suddenly felt impossibly heavy. His arms shook with effort as he struggled to complete a single repetition. Rico rushed to spot him, helping guide the bar back to the rack. "You okay, boss?" he asked, genuine concern in his voice. Tommy sat up slowly, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. The psychological impact of yesterday's defeat was manifesting in physical ways he didn't understand. Dr. Mitchell had explained to him that there were no lasting effects from what had happened in the gym. His nervous system had suffered a temporary disruption, but all his tests came back normal. Yet Tommy felt different. The confidence that had always flowed through his muscles like electricity seemed to have been short-circuited. Across the yard, an older inmate named Professor Williams watched the scene unfold with academic interest. Williams had earned his nickname through 40 years of reading everything he could get his hands on, turning his cell into a makeshift library, and his mind into an encyclopedia of random knowledge. He'd studied martial arts through books and documentaries, understanding the theory even if he'd never practiced the techniques. Internal martial arts, he murmured to his chess partner, a soft-spoken forger named David Chen, who happened to share Marcus's surname, though they weren't related. Most people think fighting is about external power, bigger muscles, harder punches, faster movements, but there's a whole other approach based on redirecting energy rather than generating it. David moved his queen forward and considered the statement. You really think that's what we saw yesterday? Some kind of ancient Chinese secret? Professor Williams smiled at the cultural reference. Not ancient secrets, just principles that most people don't understand. Leverage, timing, anatomy. When you know exactly where and how to apply pressure, you don't need much force to achieve dramatic results. A small key can open a massive door if you know where the lock is. Their conversation was overheard by several nearby inmates, adding another layer to the growing mythology surrounding Marcus Chen. Stories were evolving and spreading, each retelling adding new elements of mystery and wonder. Some inmates were beginning to view Marcus as something approaching supernatural, but Marcus himself remained focused on his practice, seemingly oblivious to the attention he was drawing. His movements continued in their measured rhythm, each transition flowing seamlessly into the next. To trained eyes, his form was nearly perfect. Every angle was precise, every shift of weight deliberate and controlled. A guard named Officer Patterson watched from his elevated position in the tower, speaking into his radio in low tones. Population seems unusually quiet today. No incidents to report, but there's definitely something different about the atmosphere down there. His supervisor's voice crackled back through the speaker. Different how? Patterson struggled to articulate what he was observing. It's like everyone's waiting for something to happen, but not the usual kind of tension before a fight breaks out. This feels more like respect than fear. The distinction was important, though Patterson didn't fully understand why. Fear was a temporary emotion that could turn into rage or desperation without warning. Respect was more stable, more predictable. Men who feared each other were always on the edge of violence. Men who respected each other were more likely to find peaceful solutions to their conflicts. As the afternoon progressed, small groups began forming around different areas of the yard. Near the basketball courts, younger inmates debated what they'd witnessed, their conversations mixing street knowledge with half-remembered movies about martial arts masters. By the weight area, Tommy's crew maintained their loyalty while privately questioning what it meant for their own status and protection. That day changed Riverside Correctional forever. Marcus Chen had proven that real strength wasn't about size or aggression. It was about discipline, patience, and understanding forces most people never even knew existed. Tommy Rodriguez eventually found his own path to respect, learning that leadership didn't require fear. The prison became quieter, more thoughtful. Men started solving problems with words instead of fists. And Marcus? He served the rest of his time in peace, teaching a few select inmates the gentle art his grandfather had passed down to him. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who never needs to prove it. True power flows like water, soft enough to nurture, strong enough to carve through stone. That's the lesson of Tai Chi, and that's the lesson Marcus taught an entire prison with just one perfect movement.